editor at The Diplomat and Director of Research at Diplomatic Risk Intelligence. In an unexpected development on February 25th, India and Pakistan announced their recommitment to a 2003 ceasefire along the line of control and other disputed sections of the border between the arch rivals. The announcement, which came amid progress in military disengagement between Chinese and Indian forces in the east of Ladakh, and as US President Joe Biden's entrance into office, had surprised many analysts and observers. Almost exactly 2 years before, India had launched airstrikes inside mainland Pakistan, leading Pakistan to retaliate in kind in India-administered Kashmir. New Delhi's August 2019 decision to effectively abrogate the constitutionally guaranteed special autonomous status of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir had also led many to be pessimistic about the future of the India-Pakistan relations, at least in the medium term. But the latest announcement is a welcome development. It is one of the many ceasefire recommitments that have taken place in the recent past, including one in 2018 and the other one in 2013, where both sides have affirmed to a ceasefire and along the line of control. However, this time around, what's different is its language. And the language and the tone and the background of the announcement that led many observers of South Asia to find and what lies ahead. Could the announcement be prelude to dialogue between the two countries? Can both Islamabad and New Delhi square the domestic compulsions with geopolitical imperatives to bring lasting peace in the region? What role has external powers played in securing the ceasefire? And could the ceasefire indeed be made to last? To look at these and other similar questions, we are joined by three eminent experts on South Asian political and security affairs. Dr. Madhya Afzal is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. Her research lies at the intersection of political economy, development, and security with a focus on Pakistan. Afzal is the author of Pakistan Under Siege, Extremism, Society, and the State, which was published by Brookings Institution in 2018. Michael Coogan, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., is a leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan and their relations with the United States. The editor or co-editor of 11 books he has written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and other publications on a range of topics, including the US policy in Afghanistan. Finally, we have Dr. Asfandyar Mir, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Asfandyar holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. His research spans international security and comparative politics with a focus on political violence, Al-Qaeda, and South Asian security issues. So welcome all three of you and welcome viewers. So let me start with you, Madhya, and ask you, how do you see Pakistan's motivations and drivers behind the ceasefire, and what may have led Pakistan to agree to something like this in the first place?
Thank you, Abhijnan, for the introduction and for convening this session. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'll be pretty brief. I think you've mentioned some of the background here, but this really comes as a surprise, I think, from both sides. I'll concentrate, of course, on the Pakistani side. It comes as a surprise given sort of the acrimony in the relationship of late, that began in many ways with the Pulwama attack of 2019 that you mentioned. So this comes 2 years after Pulwama, but also, of course, India's revocation of Kashmir's autonomy in 2019, in August 2019, and Pakistan's reaction to that. Given the ceasefire violations of late, which had only been increasing, as you mentioned, the ceasefire that was agreed upon in 2003, violations have been ongoing since 2008. But they've really increased since 2014 with the Modi government. And in particular, there were reportedly about 5,000 violations in just 2020. So given the increasing number of ceasefire violations, and just given the heightened rhetoric in both countries against each other, and I'm sure, again, Michael may concentrate more on India, so I'll concentrate more on the Pakistani side. I mean, this heightened rhetoric, again, this sort of has its ups and downs, but in particular, it benefits both countries politically. And the Modi government has been all too eager to engage in such rhetoric. But in recent months, the Pakistani state has also pointed fingers at India, much as it did in sort of the heyday of the Pakistani Taliban, as attacks in Pakistan, as the Pakistani Taliban has shown a resurgence in Pakistan's tribal areas, fingers have been pointed towards India again. And a few months ago, the Pakistani state, sort of in a splash of media, released a dossier about that sort of pointed the blame at attacks in Pakistan on India. So from Pakistan's perspective, this sort of coming out of the blue comes as a bit of a surprise. And given the timing, given that it comes at the beginning of a new US administration, there is obviously speculation about what role the United States may have played here. Of course, the Biden administration has said sort of officially that it has encouraged and supported sort of this kind of bilateral dialogue. And the key here is that it's being very careful and being proper, as opposed to the Trump administration, where Trump basically committed a faux pas in 2019 when he met Imran Khan and said he was willing to mediate, and India hit back against him. So there's speculation about the US role, but we don't know that there has been any. So the official line is that there was hotline contact between the DGMOs, the Director Generals of Military Operations of both countries, and that is sort of a line of contact that began in 1971 and has been sort of sporadic since. And with this hotline contact, this was agreed upon. And I think, some have speculated that the intelligence agencies may have been involved. And there was initially a great deal of speculation and reporting about NSA level contact, National Security Advisor level contact in particular, and sort of secret meetings that have been held behind the scenes between Ajit Doval on the Indian side and Mueed Yusuf, who's sort of the NSA equivalent in Pakistan. And Mueed Yusuf had hinted that there may have been behind the scenes meetings in an answer to a question, but then when there was reporting on from an Indian newspaper, he sort of came out and denied that and sort of said that this is entirely based on hotline contact between the DGMOs. So again, there's speculation, and again, there's sort of an idea that there's been behind the scenes action, but all we know is that it has happened due to hotline contact. I'll come back a little bit to the motivations. What is interesting is that the statement says, in the interest of achieving mutually beneficial and sustainable peace, the two DGMOs agreed to address each other's core issues and concerns, which have the propensity to disturb peace and lead to violence. So the idea that this goes beyond a ceasefire to actually going forward to addressing core issues, and in Pakistan's case, that would be Kashmir, is really interesting. And we'll wait to see what happens there. So it's notable that the Chief of Army Staff, General Bajwa, that month in February, had given a speech to army officers and said, it is the time to extend the hand of peace in all directions. And so, coming at the start of a new US administration, does this mean that Pakistan, one of the motivations for Pakistan may have been sort of its the notion that it is putting forward, and a number of people in the Pakistani government have put this forward, and academics in Pakistan are putting this forward as well, that Pakistan wants to move towards a more geo-economic approach to its relationship with the United States, and not look at sort of this strategic approach towards its relationship with the United States. And it doesn't want its relationship with the United States, and sort of the view of Pakistan in the world to be dominated by strategic concerns. And if that is the case, is Pakistan trying to sort of put a neat bow on its relationship with India? That could be some sort of cause for speculation. Again, hinting at that, this might be something that makes the U.S. happy and sort of appeases it. One thing to note is that Pakistan had said that it would not engage with India unless India sort of cancels its revocation of Kashmir's autonomy. So this shows you the limits in many ways of rhetoric. But given the heady speculation in Pakistan after this, I mean, we have to sort of think about public opinion. And in Pakistan's case, going forward, it will be constrained a little bit by public opinion. Of course, this is public opinion that the state has itself sown over decades. And you had asked me to touch upon that, and I will a little bit, just so that there's a little bit of an idea. But Pakistan's decisions and Pakistan's actions will be constrained by public opinion. But again, we should recognize that public opinion is organic and it's been driven by the state. One thing I'll mention here is, and this I'm sure holds true for India, and I've seen the numbers for India as well. The majority of Pakistanis hold unfavorable views of India. That should not come as a surprise. In 2015, we have 70% of Pakistanis holding unfavorable views of India. The anti-India sentiment goes hand in hand with pro-Kashmir sentiment and a sympathy with the cause of Kashmiri jihadist groups, though many Pakistanis will say that they denounce the violence of Kashmiri jihadist groups. Pakistanis will support self-determination for Kashmir. The revocation of Kashmir's autonomy in 2019 was extremely unpopular in Pakistan. Many Pakistanis see India as a threat and see India as sort of out to get it. This is a narrative that really, again, that has been driven by the state over decades, over 7 decades, and it's sort of ingrained in Pakistan's textbooks. But the important thing is, this is the key, that this narrative is not immutable. These views are not immutable. They go up and down, so they can change. And when asked, Pakistanis do say that they support peace, right? So 70% of Pakistani respondents, as they said that they had unfavorable views of India, they also said they favored talks between India and Pakistan. So public opinion is something that can be constrained, that can be sort of changed. But in some ways, the state has to sort of decide, right? It's sort of a fine line that it's walking. Blaming terrorism on India, sort of with that splashy release of that dossier, and then sort of extending the hand of peace. How is it going to present this to the public? So I think Pakistan, going forward, will continue doing what it's been doing on Kashmir, but within limits. I mean, its actions to date have not really been very effective in terms of sort of talking about Article 370. And so, if there's an opportunity for it to sort of rest a little bit on its eastern border with this ceasefire, this ceasefire agreement, it will. Just a couple of other things that I want to mention, and then I'll turn it over. This does come in the background of a pandemic, right? Where both countries have been dealing with, obviously the loss of life and sort of all the public health concerns that come with the pandemic, but then, the economic externalities, the negative economic externalities, of course, of the pandemic. And so both have suffered economically. And so, not having skirmishes on the line of control is a good thing for them in any context, but in particular in this context of a pandemic and the crisis that brings. And then there have been political issues. And again, I won't touch upon the Indian side, but in Pakistan, there's been a lot of domestic political sort of drama, if you will, over the last year, in particular with the Pakistan Democratic Movement, its rallies, it trying to destabilize trying to not necessarily destabilize the government, but, engaging in sort of the usual politics that comes with an opposition in Pakistan, and trying to get the government to resign. So it comes in a context where, again, there's a lot that's going on domestically. And this is sort of logically a smart decision for Pakistan to take. Again, the speculation, I think I'm happy to engage in more on where exactly it came from. And I think Mueed Yusuf had hinted in 2020 in an interview that the hand of peace was extended by India, but I'm happy to sort of discuss further in terms of what Michael and Nasfandyar and you have to say about the motivations.
Thank you so much, Madhya, for giving us a background on what could be the drivers behind Pakistan's coming to independence. Michael, let me turn to you about India and what sort of an analogous set of questions I posed to her. Because, in terms of context, it seems that Mr. Modi, in the run-up to the 2019 elections, had made a lot of gains, one could argue, by raising Pakistan, by raising Balakot, Pulwama, that set of events. And he has considerable political capital. So if you could somehow situate this decision within this larger backdrop of what's happening in Indian politics and other motivations, including security motivations, that would be great.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for featuring me in this discussion. So indeed, I'll get right to it. What might explain the Indian government's decision to pursue and conclude this ceasefire, keeping in mind domestic political considerations? And I'll offer three possible reasons. First, I would argue that the domestic political circumstances in India were sufficiently favorable, and largely because of Prime Minister Modi. Modi is what I like to call a Teflon man, which is a term originally used to describe Ronald Reagan, I believe, many years ago. So basically, political challenges and vulnerabilities, they don't stick to him. He can overcome it largely because he's a very popular leader in India. So when it comes to a bold move like reaching out to your enemy to negotiate a ceasefire, that's not going to hurt him or his ruling party or his government politically. And additionally, Modi has cred, so to speak, as a hawk on Pakistan because of the surgical strikes several years ago, the Balakot strike a bit more recently, the tough talk and the anti-Pakistan rhetoric that he's espoused for much of the last 5 years, including on the campaign trail a few years back, as I believe you suggested. So he has the insulation, so to speak, to protect himself from charges of appeasing Pakistan if he's to go ahead and negotiate this ceasefire. And another factor that I think gave Modi the political space to reach out to the enemy, so to speak, is that the border truce is a very narrowly focused deal. It commits with Pakistan to a ceasefire along the border, but it does not give up anything to Pakistan or make any specific promises to do anything later. There's just a vaguely worded pledge to focus on core issues, but that's sufficiently vague that it doesn't commit India to anything at all. A second reason why India might have been willing to do this ceasefire is one that I think would also apply in Pakistan. And that is quite simply a recognition that the violence along the border had gotten too high. Now, as Madhya mentioned, you had a huge number of ceasefire violations last year. I believe it was the highest number that had been there in nearly 2 decades. So in other words, I think there was a recognition in India that the violence was simply too high and that something had to be done about it. In this sense, the Modi government can frame this decision as a humanitarian gesture, an effort to protect the lives of Indians, especially civilians along the border. And this is something that can play well politically, especially with Indians already experiencing so many hardships, like Pakistanis on the other side, economic stress and the pandemic, of course. And on a related note to this idea of seizing a simple opportunity to ease tensions by reducing border violence, so TCA Raghavan, who's I think one of the most respected Indian voices on the India-Pakistan relationship, he said recently that this ceasefire represents part of the natural cycle of India-Pakistan relations, which have periods of highs and lows, and then it was simply time to bring down the temperatures a bit and reduce instability a bit, and that this ceasefire was a great way to do so. So I think there's something to that. The third reason why India might have wanted to pursue this ceasefire gets into some of the broader geopolitical issues at hand. First, if you calm one border, you can focus more on the one with China. There have been, of course, some partial troop disengagements after the Ladakh crisis, but India still faces a major threat. And the Ladakh crisis showed that Beijing has the ability to make incursions across the border and that India is not really in a position to stop them. So I think you could argue that Delhi wants to focus on what is the much bigger and long-term strategic threat. India cannot afford a two-front war or even the threat of one. And I think Asfandyar will get into this more when he speaks. Second point here, Pakistan's foreign policy has evolved or has appeared to evolve in ways that can perhaps provide some reassurance to India that would make it less hesitant to make a ceasefire deal at this juncture. As Medea mentioned, Pakistan has been pitching itself as a key locus for geoeconomics and connectivity projects. Not the first time it's done this. It's done this many times in the past, pre-Imran Khan's government, but it's really been intensifying that narrative now. But also, it's not just the talk, it's also what it's doing. Pakistan has been, for example, pursuing a lot of negotiations with Central Asian states on new connectivity projects, including a new intra-Afghan rail project stretching from Uzbekistan to Pakistan. So it is following up that, these claims that it wants to be seen differently, focusing on connectivity issues, infrastructure, and so on. And additionally, while it's been making a lot of noise about Kashmir and public messaging and diplomacy, I think my sense in India is that Pakistan has not been causing trouble in Kashmir in a kinetic sense of late. There's no indications that you have heavy traffic of Pakistan-sponsored militants heading across the border into Kashmir of late. And all this could perhaps be seen by New Delhi as an indication that now is a fortuitous time to reach out to Pakistan and agree to this border ceasefire. A third geopolitical factor that I think gives India an incentive to make this move is the new administration in Washington. I think Medea has sort of got into this a bit from the Pakistan side. India is clearly very keen to strengthen its relations with the US. It grudgingly accepts that the new administration, like the previous one, wants Pakistan to be involved in the peace process in Afghanistan. So New Delhi likely assumed that the Biden administration would pressure India to try to bury the hatchet with Pakistan to some extent, so that Pakistan could free up more policy space to focus on the Afghanistan theater. India also knows that concern about China drives US-India partnership the most, and that the US would want India to have more bandwidth to focus on the China problem on its border. And obviously you get more bandwidth by stabilizing your border with Pakistan. And more broadly, just based on some conversations I've had with people in New Delhi of late, there appears to be a sense within the government there that the Biden administration will look for stepped up partnership with India on the Quad, on the Indo-Pacific policy, and so on, all of which India is, of course, keen to do as well. And it's just easier to do that when you're not bogged down with the Pakistan problem, so to speak. So very briefly, I've been asked to address whether this ceasefire can last and whether from India's perspective, the momentum from it could be maintained. Certainly potentially there are additional spaces to expand cooperation, like opening up more trade and looking to other non-security spaces. And from what I understand, talks are afoot to reinstate each country's high commissioner. There may also be an opportunity for the two to participate in a future SARC summit. Opening up more trade is a great potential confidence building measure, though India, as the larger economy of the two, wouldn't necessarily get as many benefits from that as Pakistan would. But I think at any rate, India will need to be careful politically about expanding cooperation with Pakistan at this point. It's one thing to conclude a ceasefire meant to lower violence on the border and bring relief to Indian citizens, but it's quite another to engage more with Pakistan diplomatically beyond that. That may be risky. Modi's harsh anti-Pakistan rhetoric on the campaign trail helped him win re-election. And there are several key state elections coming up in the next few weeks. Modi is, of course, still very popular, but he knows, I'm sure, that his ruling party has faced some pressures in recent months from the pandemic, from a struggling economy, which is showing signs of recovery, and from anti-government protests from farmers. So he'll need to be careful not to push too far too quickly on engagement with Pakistan, and anything that is done will have to be done fairly quietly. And also, for all the talk in the joint statement that came out of the ceasefire of working together to tackle core issues, I don't see much incentive for forward movement on the Indian side. India's core issue, so to speak, is Pakistan-based terrorism. It'll be much more likely to do dialogue with Pakistan, to do more trade and so on after it sees Pakistan doing more about the terrorism issue. And New Delhi, particularly this government, will set a very high bar for what it deems acceptable. It won't be enough for Pakistan to be taking the type of steps that it's done as part of its FATF agenda, which has entailed arresting, convicting several India-focused terror leaders. India will want full justice for the Mumbai attacks, and it will want the full terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan to be eliminated, and that's likely not in the cards. If there's one big ticket initiative for India-Pakistan cooperation that I could see New Delhi endorsing, it would be including Pakistan in pandemic-related regional cooperation. That would help advance Modi's goal of being a leader in regional responses to the pandemic. It would dovetail nicely with New Delhi's broader goal of vaccine diplomacy, whether through bilateral channels or multilaterally as within the Quad. And Pakistan has in fact signaled its interest of late in cooperating with India on regional cooperation on the pandemic. So that would make India's decision even easier. All this said, and I'll end here, it won't take much at all for this ceasefire to be shattered and for the two sides to be back to square one. Obviously, if there's one single terrorist attack in Kashmir or India more broadly, India would likely blame it on Pakistan, and then we could expect, I think, a crisis worse than the Pulwama Balakot one, given that each side had showed a willingness during that crisis to scale up the use of conventional force within the nuclear umbrella. So an Indian military response comparable, if not more robust than the Balakot strike, would be quite likely. I will wrap up there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Michael, for the summary of what you assess to be India's or the other drivers behind India's acceptance of this decision. You have touched upon this larger geopolitical context and issues that may have played some role in India and Pakistan both agreed to this. Asfandir, I want you to focus more on this, right? Because as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, one of the things that happened literally weeks before the ceasefire announcement was made on February 25th is that you have India-China limited disengagement in the north and south bank of the Bengal Lake. And also, of course, there is this larger context of a new administration in Washington. So if you can just kind of wrap all of these issues in one package, and also maybe look at the Afghanistan situation and
sure.
to what extent that may have played.
Sure. Thanks, Abhi. I hope, can you hear me fine? Okay. So we are in a unique moment in India-Pakistan ties where both sides have a strong need to lower the level of hostility, in my view, primarily due to the international political environment. I'm not saying that the two sides are willing to make major concessions to each other, which is one interpretation of the joint statement issued at the time of the restoration of the ceasefire. I don't agree with that, but I do think there is interest in de-escalation, less hostility, and I think some pullback, perhaps sustained low-level engagement with modest goals. The question is why. So let me start with India's international sort of politics logic. From the Indian perspective, as I read, the current re-engagement marks the end of its coerced Pakistan policy launched in roughly 2016 after the Pathankot terror attack. Around that time, the Indian government seems to have determined that it wanted to impose lots of costs on Pakistan for an extended period of time to get Pakistan to back off from sponsoring violence, stoking separatism, as well as laying any kind of territorial claim on Kashmir. Really, it was a moonshot policy. And to that end, India sought to mobilize its diplomatic heft, firepower along the border with Pakistan, especially the LOC, and then counter stoking of separatism publicly, stepped up support of proxy actors inside Pakistan. But in addition, a key assumption at the time was that after a long time, the US was frustrated enough with Pakistan to mount a separate coercive effort against the Pakistani government for supporting the Afghan Taliban and Kashmiri jihadists. Initially, the Indian calculation on coordinated pressure with the US appeared to work. In 2016, the Obama administration was starting to really ratchet up pressure on Pakistan. There was even discussion of designating Pakistan as a state sponsor of terror. In 2017, US-Pakistan bilateral ties nearly collapsed. President Trump announced an end to all aid to Pakistan and even put sanctions on the table, including the threat of lobbying for blacklisting Pakistan via FATF. But then in 2018, the U.S. government had a change of heart for reasons independent of South Asia on how it wanted to end the war in Afghanistan. And the US government decided that instead of coercing the Afghan Taliban into some kind of peace settlement and getting Pakistan to deny Taliban a safe haven, it wanted to engage with the Taliban directly and swiftly to negotiate an end to the war, and that it wanted Pakistan's help to negotiate with the Taliban. In 2019, we saw real movement in US-Pakistan relations. Despite Pulwama and Balakot, then President Trump received Prime Minister Khan at the White House. And then, after August 2019, Indian decision to revoke Kashmir's autonomy, it was met with grumblings by the State Department. The focus mostly shifted away from coercing Pakistan, at least in US policy. By the time we get to 2020 and the India-China standoff, started picking up, the key premise of India's coerced Pakistan policy since 2016 was all but diluted, which was US pressure. Moreover, Chinese pressure on India was now fairly intense. We now know that India has had to move military formations, including the Pakistan, at one point Pakistan focus, and perhaps even now to an extent, the mechanized strike corps in Mathura, which would otherwise be in holding positions for offensive confrontations with Pakistan, really threatens piercing strikes inside Pakistan. That's now been moved towards in the area of the Northern Core. And by implication is more likely to be used against China. There's a realistic concern on the Indian side that China can get Pakistan to open a front if need be. To all of this is to say that India has run the course of its coercive policy against Pakistan, given that the US needs a more functional relationship with Pakistan for its Afghanistan endgame. Also, India has a very real China problem with the two-front possibility at its doorstep. The logic of coercing Pakistan in Indian foreign policy is done for now. Quickly on Pakistan, why did Pakistan agree to this, or specifically, how has international politics played into Pakistan's calculus? Pakistan has been hemmed in for much longer than India. Relations with the US, NATO, EU, and even the Gulf have been fairly bumpy. The US obviously brings up Kashmiri jihadists and Afghan Taliban in almost all interactions with senior Pakistani interlocutors. The multilateral FATF gray listing is a major problem, and the fear of a blacklisting has been real, even though that concerns down. So in that backdrop, Pakistan doesn't want a hot LOC. It has wanted the level of violence to go down. And I see the logic of low levels of violence for infiltration of militants, but I'm not persuaded of the utility of the high levels, heavy caliber engagement, 155 millimeter artillery, for instance, as we have seen play out over the last few years. That I think Pakistan doesn't perceive that kind of violence to be in its interest. Hot LOC is costly in other ways, especially at a time when Pakistani economy has been clocking near zero economic growth rates. And I also think that since August 2019, Pakistan wants the focus to remain on the situation on Indian excesses in Kashmir and less on the border and Pakistan-backed militancy. I think given how aggressively US officials have sought to get Pakistan to back off from supporting anti-India jihadists, I think Pakistani officials at least the Army Chief Bajwa, understands what is most likely to distract his American interlocutors. Some analysts are wondering why Pakistan isn't taking advantage of India while it is under pressure by China. I think it's a fair contention, but the reality is that Pakistan faces its own set of economic, domestic, and geopolitical constraints, which limit its ability to exploit India's moment of weakness. Let me round off this discussion with a word on third parties. Have they been involved, or how? So starting with the US, I don't see the US government, especially the Biden administration, super involved until now. That said, it is not a secret, and Michael mentioned it in his comments. The US government's bureaucratic momentum due to Indo-Pacific strategy is to get India to focus more on China, lessen interest in military engagements with Pakistan. The US wants India to become a continental power with an expeditionary military. It doesn't want India-Pakistan ties to be on the cusp of nuclear conflict all the time. I think the Trump administration was nudging both sides into engagement, but not more. And going forward, I expect Biden to encourage and foster a re-engagement, not in the interest of generic peace alone in South Asia, but because it's a net good outcome for the US's Indo-Pacific policy, as well as South Asia policies and the future of US policy towards Afghanistan. What about China? It is possible China may have nudged Pakistan to take a step back, given its own concurrent disengagement with India. China may have wanted to reduce Indian anxiety of an active two-front threat, especially as China seeks its own reset with the US. More generally, my sense is that the Chinese advocate less hostility with India to Pakistani policymakers. Finally, an unlikely actor has entered the fray of third parties, and we haven't seen them play much of a role the last 7 decades, but they are playing a role now, which is the Middle East. Sushant Singh, famous Indian journalist, has written about the UAE having mediated the thaw. I put a lot of stock in that. My own information aligns with what Sushant is reporting. And I think there's a reason for it. Bad India-Pakistan ties are bad for both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, put them in a very difficult position. So I can see why they have tried to get involved. But it would be interesting to know more about the Middle Eastern dimension to the current talk. So I'm going to stop there. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you all three of you for excellent set of remarks. And what listening to all three of you, the sense I got was that each set of remarks reinforced the others. There was a lot of common ground. So we're very grateful for that. So I'll abuse my position as the moderator and ask the first question, and it will be to all three of you. And it's going to be a bit open-ended. Well, where do you see Kashmir in 20 years? Right? Because it seems that every time, there is something like the ceasefire or some other development, positive or negative, we're stuck in the weeds. We're discussing who said what, who did what. But just to kind of take a broad view of things, what is the future of Kashmir? Lately, but yeah, if we could start with you.
That's a good question. It's a question on which I unfortunately, given the last, if one has to learn from history, right? Given the last 70 years, I'd have a pretty cynical answer. I would say that I would see it going in the same direction as it has been, and Pakistan and India having the same kinds of ups and downs, sort of a bit of a cool down and then raised temperatures. Save for major developments, either within either of the two countries or on the international stage, I would not necessarily see the equation, the equilibrium, the motivation, the incentives changing. And so my initial read, and I'm interested to see what Asfandyar and Michael have to say on this, and you, is that I would expect more of the same.
Michael?
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, I share Madiha's skepticism. I don't really see much changing in a good way. I think that the closest thing that we could realistically expect to some type of sort of settlement, so to speak, would be for the two sides to basically formally accept the status quo, accept the LOC as the border. But I think it's quite clear that Pakistan is not giving up on Kashmir. I think that's quite clear. I mean, we saw the reaction in Pakistan, the predictable reaction after India's decision to incorporate Jammu and Kashmir into an Indian Union territory. From India's perspective, there's nothing to discuss anymore. And the fact that the messaging in New Delhi since August 5, 2019, is that if there's to be any further dialogue with Pakistan, it would focus on our Kashmir, Pakistan-administered Kashmir. And I don't think that's not going to be in the cards anytime soon either. Now, you look back to the last best chance there was to some type of settlement, and you look at the Musharraf formula with Manmohan Singh, and you try to think, what are the types of factors that would need to be in place where you could have something similar come to be now? And it's hard to think of any that would work. I mean, you could look at this from a leadership perspective. You had two leaders that were willing to be bold and move forward. I'm not sure that I see Modi, who will, I think, be in office for quite some time longer. I don't really see him as the guy that would want to do that. On the Pakistani side, maybe a bit more room for potential receptivity to that, but not really. So yeah, I think that we're going to see the status quo continue to play out for quite some time.
Sure. So, hefty question, Kashmir in 20 years. I think starting with the situation in Kashmir itself, it's probably going to worsen. We have, the trend lines in Kashmir internally have been negative, and they've only gotten worse. I see no improvement. In fact, over the last decade, India has lost ground in the 10 districts of the valley. There's some evidence to pointing in that direction. But in terms of conflict resolution, I think the key variable is, and I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to challenge this, channel some of that. I think the key variable is resolve, and resolve to hold on to their respective positions. And India has a lot of resolve to hold on to Kashmir. India has plenty of economic heft. There's a lot of domestic political support. Prime Minister Modi has been, remains extremely popular. There is, of course, a lot of international support for India's positions. And on the Pakistani side, I think there is less economic heft and there's less international support, but there is a reservoir of domestic political capital to hold on to Kashmir and to not budge, to not even give an inch. So these are two giants which can hold on to their claim on Kashmir for a very long period of time. I think 20 years is kind of going nowhere. But two things may change. One, I think in 2020 we have seen that India-China conflict is not a moonshot idea. It can happen. So if India ends up in some kind of active conflict with China, I think that is likely to have implications on what happens in Kashmir, and the Indian government realizes that. And then, of course, some kind of India-Pakistan confrontation. We came extremely close to something terrible in February 2019. There's now a suggestion that India was readying one of its nuclear-capable missile batteries. In 2019, I've heard from the Pakistani side that they were ready to sort of escalate to the next level of the escalation ladder. So So if, say, there's a terror attack which leads to an escalation, or if something else happens which triggers escalation, I think that also can have implications on Kashmir and where the two sides end up on the issue.
So we have an audience question about the role of China, but more specifically about CPEC, right? Because if you look at what was going on and the origin of the two-front threat, so to speak, last year, to my read, a lot of that had to also do with Gilgit-Baltistan in terms of India's rhetorical commitment to physically take possession of Gilgit-Baltistan someday. I'm quoting one of the members of the Indian cabinet on this. You have a lot of Chinese investments in Gilgit-Baltistan as part of CPEC and also through other means. So what I want all three of you, and I'm going to parse this down, starting with Asfandyar, then Michael, and then Badia, so this audience question, is first, to what extent does CPEC play a role in regional dynamics in very, very realistic way? That's one question that I want I want you to take a shot. But what I want you to sort of address is the domestic aspect of CPEC. Because one of the things that happens in discussions around CPEC, at least in the international press and the Indian press and American press, is we talk about it some kind of grand strategic thing. How are people in Pakistan taking CPEC, if you could give us a sense of that? And to what extent would that somehow play first into domestic politics and then international politics? So that's the second part of this question. And Michael, to what extent can CPEC, should it really blossom into something concrete, and that remains to be seen, to what extent can that serve as a persistent obstacle in this triangular dynamics between India, China, and Pakistan? So we will start with yours.
Sure. So I think it's an important question. I've been trying to wrap my head around it. So how does CPEC plays into regional politics? I think we can break the CPEC down into its two components. One of which is of course apparent, and the other one which is the one which is more apparent is the economic component of CPEC. Energy projects, infrastructure projects, road projects running from Gilgit-Baltistan down to South Pakistan. And then there's discussion of there being some kind of military component, the potential of the PLA Navy getting some kind of basing in Pakistan. So let's start with the economic component. I think there's ample concern on the Indian side that the economic component can shore up Pakistan's overall national power to a point where it leads to some kind of emboldenment. And I think one of the nightmare scenarios of Indian policymakers since the early 1990s is an emboldened Pakistan, which kind of asserts itself perhaps militarily or with asymmetric means on Kashmir. So CPEC is seen in that light. It's not, it is not perceived on the Indian side as something truly benign. The U.S. doesn't worry so much about Pakistani emboldenment, but it does worry about what this kind of economic buildup means for Chinese connectivity and how it is improving China's ability to, of course, access the Middle East, and how that might ultimately cut out the U.S. from some global commons. This is a long-term concern for U.S. policymakers, and on which they end up aligning with the with Indian policymakers. Then there is discussion of the military component. I think opinions on that vary. My sense is that the U.S. sees it as a possibility, as not something which is likely to happen in the near term. So on that question, the thinking appears to be somewhat fuzzy. On the Indian side, that concern is far more far more real. They suspect that that there's some kind of strategic collaboration between the Chinese and the Pakistani militaries already afoot, which is being set up to balance India.
Michael, thoughts? Oh, I'm so sorry. Was it Madhya or Michael? And now I got confused. I think it was Madhya. Sorry, apologies.
No problem. Either way. Yes. So very briefly, actually, on public opinion in Pakistan on CPEC, right? So what does the Pakistani population think of it? That was your question for me, right? Right. So there's broad domestic support for CPEC. I think that's the first point, and a lot of that broad domestic support, of course, is driven by the state's narrative on CPEC, which is very positive. The state sort of hand in hand with the Chinese state touts it, and they're broadly Pakistanis hold favorable views towards China. Again, driven by the state, and then that trickles down in many ways to views on CPEC. I think there's been reporting about sort of aspects of how pervasive and how broad and deep CPEC might go, especially when Dawn came out with its report on sort of all the sectors, the agricultural sector, sort of, surveillance, all sorts of things that CPEC was doing. There were murmurs of sort of concern, certainly in the Pakistani population. So it's not that Pakistanis don't respond to potential knowledge of CPEC reaching the hand of CPEC reaching farther and wider than they knew. But the state has pushed back on that, and I think the population has broadly bought it. I think there is sort of the sense that who else is investing this much in Pakistan, right? Nobody else is. The U.S. isn't. The U.S. doesn't have the capability to, nor the interest to. It's a very different economic model of investment. So who else is investing that much? China is. So we might as well take it. There are going to be some benefits to it, but I think Pakistanis recognize some of the disadvantages that come with it. So the fact that there's Chinese labor on projects, it's not that Pakistani workers are necessarily benefiting. I think there are sort of human rights concerns, not necessarily on what's happening in China, because that is not talked about in Pakistan, sort of the issue with Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, but more on Chinese workers' exploitation of Pakistanis in particular, Pakistani women. Sort of there was this sort of reporting on human trafficking, but all of that news is really in a way far more than other issues, even within Pakistan, that news is kind of blocked from reaching the Pakistani public. You don't sort of see it discussed in newspapers and on TV channels, because that is an implicit, basically, agreement with the Chinese state in how the flow of information about China is controlled in Pakistan. So in terms of public opinion, it's broadly good, and I think it's going to remain that way, and it's largely due to the Pakistani state deciding on that.
Michael?
Yes. No, absolutely. This is an important question, and the issue of what extent does CPEC play a role in this triangle, so to speak. I think you have to look at it in the context of the wider Belt and Road Initiative. So India opposes CPEC for two reasons. One, CPEC and BRI more broadly serve as the main vehicle for China's deepening footprint in South Asia, in India's neighborhood, and it intensifies these longstanding concerns of many in India of the so-called notion of China's string of pearls and strategic encirclement of India. So in effect, CPEC and more broadly BRI bring something concrete to India's longstanding fears. Second, CPEC, as I think you had mentioned before, CPEC is envisioned to go through territory that India claims, Gilgit-Baltistan. India historically, to my understanding, has not taken up GB, Gilgit-Baltistan, as an issue as much as it has Pakistan-administered Kashmir. But it's with the current government, with the Modi government, we've heard more sharp, intensifying rhetoric about Gilgit-Baltistan. Now, another important point to make here, I think, is that CPEC and India's opposition to it gives Pakistan a stronger incentive to accuse India of being behind the various manifestations of anti-China militancy in Pakistan in recent months, particularly these acts carried out by Baluch separatists, the BLA and so forth. So I think that India's opposition to CPEC, along with a particularly tense India-China relationship, it gives Pakistan an incentive to make this argument of Indian sponsorship of anti-China militancy in Pakistan, which has been an increasingly common theme we're hearing from Pakistan, particularly after the release of that dossier. And much of the militancy in Pakistan over the last few years, at a moment when the Pakistan Taliban-like anti-state militancy, the Islamist militancy, that's been significantly degraded. So a lot of the terrorist activities taking place in Pakistan have been, there've been quite a few carried out by groups that are targeting China. And again, this is something that, given the geopolitical situation, given Indian sentiment about CPEC, and given the extent of the India-China tensions, I think that Pakistan can present what it would think would be a particularly believable and credible critique about alleged Indian sponsorship of these groups in Pakistan. So thank you.
Okay, so we have one question from the audience, and I suspect looking at the time, the last one. So again, I want all three of you to take a shot at this. Role of European Union and Russia, right? Because where are they? Are they here? Are they interested? Are they disinterested? So 60 seconds each, three of you. So we can start in any order, like whoever wants to get it. Madhya?
Yeah, I don't necessarily see a huge role here. And, I'd be curious to see again what the others have to say. To me, the players that we discussed were the players that are involved in this. Or have a stake here, more of a stake here. And that's obviously, other than Pakistan and India, that's the US, China, and in an interesting point, the Gulf countries. I would, and so I'm actually going to take 30 of my 60 seconds just to sort of close out and say, the one really important, I think, theme that has emerged and that we should really sort of look at going forward is how public opinion in both countries constrains movements on this issue, on the issue of the LOC and on the issue of India-Pakistan relations, on the issue of Kashmir going forward. And again, as I noted, public opinion is moldable, but that is a very long-term proposition. To date, it has benefited both countries to mold public opinion in a certain way that, has led it to having sort of two very belligerent and hawkish populations now on these issues. And how that public opinion will constrain actions going forward is something that we really need to be thinking about, even as the states may start to have some incentives or some motivations to look the other way, or may face outside pressure to change. Their population's public opinion might start constraining them.
I can follow up now with I could take 30 seconds. I think that Europe, oh, sorry, what's that?
Yeah, so yeah, I was playing with the microphone. So I want, Michael, just the same question, but I wanted you to, I mentioned European Union and Russia. Then it struck me that the UK is no longer part of the European Union. So UK, so you're 60 seconds.
Yeah, I was just going to say that these countries that were mentioned, and also the UK, I think that the front you need to look to at this point is Afghanistan, right? I think we've seen that the UK has been taking on an intensifying role in trying to promote efforts to advance the peace process in Afghanistan. I think that's very clear. Russia is certainly a player in South Asia, particularly because its relations with Pakistan are starting to take off, even as its relations with India fall off a bit amid an intensifying US-India relationship. But yeah, if I think about the UK, I think about what it's up to in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's fun, yeah.
So I think the EU as a whole wants to lessen tensions. It is interested in a thaw, in continued engagement, but then there are divisions. UK, as Michael noted, as you pointed out, is more receptive to Pakistani positions and concerns. That's been the case historically. I think the UK has lent an ear to Pakistan to voice its concerns on what India does with respect to Kashmir and with respect to Pakistan in general. France, on the other hand, is on the other end of the spectrum. France has aggressively backed India at the UN, in other places. And Germany is kind of somewhere in the middle, it appears. So there's some diversity in how major EU countries and some countries which are no longer EU approach the issue. Russia is more interesting. I think, as I read it, I see the Russian government assessing that India gravitates towards the US, not just due to this emerging China problem it has, but partly due to its Pakistan problem. And that in some ways frustrates the Russian government, which has such a long and deep and strategic relationship with India, and it would really like that relationship to hold out. So on the one hand, I think it welcomes an India-Pakistan talk, because less India-Pakistan tension makes India look less towards the US. But in order to get sort of keep India in line, I think Russia is also willing to play hardball by catering to some Pakistani concerns. The fact that India was not invited to the ongoing conversation, or to the conversation that's about to happen in Moscow related to Afghanistan. I think there's a message there, and it's I see it as part of some of the hardball tactics that Russia is willing to play with India.
Well, I mean, this has been a very interesting discussion for the past 1 hour. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I think one of the things that, if I had to put forward one key takeaway from what all three of you have said, that there is perhaps some reason to be cautiously optimistic about what follows February 25th. But most of the factors that were there, that have been at play, whether that is public opinion, domestic politics, international factors, they are likely going forward, and so this optimism that many may have for what transpired may indeed have to be quite tempered, quite cautious. So on that note, thank you all three of you for joining us today, and thank you viewers for joining us. Bye.